Okay, great. Thank you very much for this invitation to present at the Accountability in a Sustainable World Conference. My name is Gurpal Sran. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at New York University Stern School of Business. And today I'll be talking about missing supply chain linkages and how they're relevant to our understanding of corporate social responsibility in supply chains. So, a motivation for the research: external stakeholders increasingly demand supply chain transparency. That means firms should know where and how their goods are produced and in turn communicate this knowledge to their stakeholders. Yet transparency remains limited in the US. We don't have a lot of granular information about firms' supply chain linkages. Borrowing this figure from Bateman and Benani, a Harvard Business Review piece, you'll see that the majority of US firms are in this lower left quadrant of transparency. That means they don't provide a lot of information about their supply chains, nor do they provide it with much depth into their supply chains, that is, their tier one, tier two, and tier three suppliers. So, why do many firms not voluntarily disclose or even redact granular information about their supply chain network? Well, there's possible costs of granular disclosure. So, in the academic literature, we often talk about what I call here traditional competitor based proprietary costs, that you're worried about revealing as a firm information about your valuable suppliers, your goods shipped, your prices. Why? Because that secret sauce of your operations could harm your competitive advantage. In this paper, we're going to focus on supply chain scrutiny costs. That is, disclosure can aid public scrutiny by third parties, and the revelation of certain linkages can spur lasting reputational damage, boycotts, financial losses, and follow on regulatory costs. This is especially relevant in the context of corporate social responsibility in supply chains. So, as an example, there's a report from a policy think tank in 2020. And with a combination of publicly available data and investigative reporting, that think tank is able to link allegations of forced labor in supplier locations to downstream brands and importers. More generally, this is a shock for the whole industry as greater attention is paid to forced labor risks. As a result, importers can face various direct and reputational costs, along with the possibility of facing reshaped regulatory regimes that make compliance more costly. And this exact setting is one that we are going to exploit later in our research. So, in a co authored paper with Sandra Schaafhuitle at Wharton, we investigate transparency in one data source on supply chain linkages. That's maritime shipment data. In this project, we assess importers' decisions to redact or mask their supply chain linkages in granular shipment level records. We then tie these decisions to a key CSR consideration in importer supply chains, that is, their forced labor risks. So in my talk today, I'll outline the insights that we gather from collecting information on the underlying institutional details regarding this setting and from our empirical analysis of shipment level records. So the first insight is that forced labor risks are really important to understand in supply chains. About 28 million people globally were in forced labor at any given time in 2021, and this was an increase from 2016 estimates. A large part of this can be attributable to businesses' activities in supply chains and profit-making behaviors. Now, also, there's a long history of forced labor provisions in U.S. customs law, starting with the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930. However, monitoring constraints means that there's incomplete regulatory oversight. You see here from Customs and Border Protection, the key agency involved with the enforcement of forced labor provisions, that they combat forced labor mainly through tips from the public, stakeholders, and other agencies, right? Because just by inspecting the goods, you don't know if they're made with forced labor. So what does this mean? Public data, and especially the shipment records we're going to look at in this study, are one of the few granular and public sources on U.S. importers' international supply chain transactions. U.S. maritime imports, which are the only imports for which this data is publicly available in the United States, cover 65% of trade by weight and 45% of trade by value. And external stakeholders, given the public availability of this data, they support the critical monitoring of supply chains and help regulators essentially engage in those enforcement actions. which can yield direct reputational costs along with follow-on regulatory costs for firms. So, even though that's a really valuable data site, the third insight from our research is that importers can redact identities from those shipment records. So, what importers can do in the United States is send a letter, email, or fill out an online application with Customs and Border Protection and redact information from shipment records for 2 year periods and do so indefinitely after that. To give you an idea of the redaction process, here is a hypothetical bill of lading for some made up companies that we have here. And this is the document that underlies these shipment records. As you'll see in a bill of lading, the type of information you can get is the name of the shipper, the name of the consignee or importer of the goods, the types and weights of goods being imported, and where those shipments are coming from and where they're going to. So what redaction allows importers to do is to redact their own identifying information from these shipment records and the identifying information of all of their shippers. Now, if you're a key external stakeholder taking a look at this data, you would still see that there was a shipment of these goods starting from that port and ending in the port of New York, but you wouldn't have the information on the particular supply chain linkage that is responsible for that transaction. Beyond this explicit redaction strategy, importers can also mask linkages through other means, right? So they can use obscure trade names, shipment intermediaries such as logistic firms, or engage in transshipping of their goods. So now let's get to the data. So that kind of lays out the setting that we're working in to understand firms' non-disclosure choices regarding their supply chain linkages. And when we look at over 100 million maritime shipment records from a data source called Panjiva from 2013 to 2023, we find our fourth insight that missing identities are prevalent in these shipment records. In recent years, about 1 in 5 shipment records coming into the United States have redacted identities. Another estimated 1 in 5 shipment records indicate shipment intermediaries as the importing firm. So that means about 2 out of 5 shipments coming into the United States by boat, we don't have a good idea of who the ultimate importer is. Redacted shipment records are also reflected across all origin countries, U.S. destination regions, and good types. And a key takeaway is that if you're a stakeholder and you're trying to track a particular importer, as you'll see in some of the graphs here, for the ones who are engaging in masking strategies, you'll notice gaps in those shipment records, which limits that stakeholder's ability to observe the supply chain associated with that importer. And finally, in the last part of the paper, we link these missing identities to forced labor risks and proxies thereof. So first, we take a cross-sectional approach. We combine similar shipments that are coming from different origin countries. And we find that shipments from origin countries with high forced labor vulnerability scores or low government response scores from walk free are more likely to have missing identities. Then in our next set of tests, we take more of a time series approach, and we see from before to after recent events related to scrutiny of forced labor risks, how do missing identities and disappearing trade names present in the data? What's important about the series of events is that even though there's often not 100% certainty about whether and where forced labor conditions exist in these supply chains, these events laid out below increase scrutiny and pressure on suppliers related to possible forced labor risks. And in fact, this is a series of events that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. These events also culminate with a major change in regulation in the United States, the UFLPA, which shifted the responsibility related to due diligence regarding forced labor risks to importers. That is, importers now face in the United States a guilty until proven innocent regime when it comes to due diligence regarding their forced labor risks. What we find is that after this series of events, you see a significant increase in missing identities and disappearing trade names in affected supply chains, which indicates that scrutiny related to forced labor risks may relate to non-disclosure decisions by firms and importers. So in conclusion, we provide evidence on supply chain scrutiny costs related to corporate social responsibility being a force correlated with and perhaps motivating non-disclosure of supply chain linkages. More broadly, missing data on supply chain linkages are non-random and in part reflect strategic disclosure behavior by firms. As reliance on big data on supply chains grows, stakeholders must carefully consider missing data problems when assessing the evolution of supply chain linkages. Important considerations associated with our research is notice that we don't observe actual occurrences of forced labor. We observe measures of forced labor risks, and we believe those forced labor risks, whether importers know very well about the conditions in their supply chains, can lead to scrutiny for those importers. Second, maritime shipment data is the only shipment data that has publicly available records. We don't have in the United States publicly available records for shipments that enter the US by air or by truck or rail. In that sense, maritime shipment data is only the tip of the iceberg, but not a meaningless one, and one that can give us a good indication of how firms engage in strategic disclosure behavior related to their supply chain linkages. So thank you very much once again for this invitation to present. And I hope that our research has some important takeaways for you regarding supply chain linkages for US importers.